On June 11th, 323 BCE, Alexander the Great died in Babylon. He was 32. He'd conquered most of the known world, declared himself a god, and then promptly checked out from a fever, leaving behind one tiny, insignificant problem. He had no succession plan. For a guy who meticulously planned 10 years of military campaigns, this feels like a bit of an oversight. His wife Roxana was pregnant, and his half-brother was mentally unfit to rule. When his generals asked who the empire should go to, he supposedly whispered, "Ti kratisti," to the strongest, which is a fantastic way to start a 30-year international royal rumble. It's less of a will and more of a contest prompt. All these hyper-ambitious Macedonian generals who had been marching in his shadow for a decade suddenly looked around the room at each other. Not with respect, but with the look of wolves deciding how to carve up a caribou. The world's largest empire was now a party favor, and everyone wanted to take a piece home. The first order of business was a meeting, because powerful men love meetings. This one is known as the Partition of Babylon. It was the ancient world's most dysfunctional corporate retreat. A general named Perdiccas, who held Alexander's signet ring, decided he was in charge. He was appointed regent for the potential heir, the unborn Alexander IV. It was a temporary solution that everyone agreed to while secretly planning to make it very, very temporary. They carved up the empire into satrapies, or provinces, for each general to manage. A clever guy named Ptolemy immediately called dibs on Egypt. It was rich, defensible, and conveniently far away from everyone else. Others got less glamorous postings. Antigonus the One-Eyed got a huge chunk of Anatolia, and the old veteran Antipater was confirmed as regent of Macedonia itself. They all swore oaths to protect the unity of the empire and the royal family. And if you believe that, I have a lovely Trojan horse to sell you. Meanwhile, back in Greece, the city-states heard the news of Alexander's death and thought, it's go time. Athens, still salty about that whole being conquered thing, led a rebellion called the Lamian War. You have to admire the optimism. It was like a chihuahua trying to fight a bear that's momentarily distracted. For a minute, it actually worked. They trapped the Macedonian regent Antipater in the city of Lamia. But then, another of Alexander's generals, Craterus, showed up with his veteran army from Asia. The rebellion was brutally crushed. Athens had its democracy dissolved and a Macedonian garrison installed. It was a heroic, tragic, and ultimately pointless gesture that proved one thing. Even when the Macedonians were busy fighting each other, they were still better at fighting than everyone else. Greece's last big shot at freedom went out with a whimper. Back in the main plot, Perdiccas, our self-appointed big boss, was having trouble keeping his ego in check. He decided that Ptolemy, chilling in Egypt, was getting too big for his britches. So he did what any reasonable Macedonian general would do. He gathered the imperial army and marched to invade. In 321 BCE, he reached the Nile. This is where his plan, Be the New Alexander, hit a snag. The snag was a very large river full of crocodiles. He tried to force a crossing and failed spectacularly. Twice. Thousands of his own men drowned or were eaten. His army, full of hardened veterans, watched this display of incompetence and thought, you are not Alexander. So his own senior officers, including a guy named Seleucus, snuck into his tent one night and stabbed him to death. The first regent of the empire was murdered by his own subordinates. The grand project of unity was going swimmingly. With Perdiccas out of the picture, the generals needed another meeting. This one, the partition of Triparadisus, was even more awkward. It was like trying to redraft fantasy football teams after the first-round pick gets a season-ending injury in week 1.
Old man Antipater was made the new regent, and the satrapies were reshuffled. Ptolemy, having successfully engineered the murder of his boss, was confirmed as ruler of Egypt. Nobody messed with Ptolemy. The big winner here was Seleucus, the guy who led the mutiny against Perdiccas. He was given the satrapy of Babylon. At the time, it probably seemed like a decent but not spectacular prize. This would be like getting ownership of a small internet search engine in 1998. It was a move that would eventually lead to the massive Seleucid Empire. They were still pretending to be governors for a king, but now the pretense was wearing thinner than a cheap toga.
You might be wondering about Alexander's actual family during all this. It's not a happy story. They weren't players, they were game pieces. Alexander's mother, Olympias, was a terrifying political operator in her own right, but she backed the wrong horses and was eventually cornered and executed by the general Cassander. His mentally handicapped half-brother, Philip III, and his wife, Eurydice, were used as puppets until Olympias had them murdered. It was a real family affair. And what about Alexander's son, the boy king Alexander IV? He and his mother Roxana were held as honored guests, which is ancient Greek for hostages, by Cassander in Macedonia. Once Cassander had consolidated his power, he had no more use for a legitimate heir. Around 310 BCE, he had both the teenage king and his mother secretly murdered. With their deaths, the Argead dynasty, the royal line of Philip II and Alexander the Great, was officially extinct. So much for protecting the empire for the rightful heir. The empire had eaten its own heart. By 306 BCE, the charade was over. Antigonus the One-Eyed was the first to blink, declaring himself and his son Demetrius as kings. The other general's response was not to fight him for being a traitor, but to immediately copy him. It was a domino effect of crowns. Ptolemy became King Ptolemy I Soter of Egypt, starting a dynasty that would last 300 years until Cleopatra. Seleucus became King Seleucus I Nicator, founding an empire that stretched from Turkey to India. Cassander became king of Macedon. The war for the unified empire was over. The wars of the new kings were just beginning. Alexander's dream of a single Hellenized world didn't die, it shattered. It broke into massive, competing pieces that spread Greek culture everywhere, but not as a unified whole. It was the most successful failure in history. In less than 2 decades, a world-spanning empire built by one man's genius was dismantled by the predictable, reliable ambition of everyone else. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!